We're going to do a series of watercolor techniques, and the first one is called a resist. A resist is when you put something on the paper that blocks the watercolor paint from getting in that area. So for this first one, we're going to use a white crayon, and we're going to press down firmly so that we get a nice, even mark of wax to get that nice resist on there. You can use it to outline areas. You can use it to put texture in areas. I just would not use it over any pencil lines because then you are setting it up where those cannot be hidden later. So if I'm outlining an area, I'll usually outline just inside or outside of my pencil lines so I'm not accidentally blocking those in there. The next type of resist is a tape resist. So you can use lots of kinds of tape. This is a very thin washi tape that we're going to use. So if there's any straight edge areas on your paper that you can use to create a tape resist, everywhere where you put the tape down, you're going to block the paint from going there. You can use this to outline areas. You can use it to put little stripes in an area. You can even use a larger type of masking tape, block an area, and use an X-Acto knife to cut out shapes in it. The hard part with that is not cutting your paper underneath of it. So here I'm making sure to get a good seal with the tape, pressing it down hard. Then I'm just kind of using my fingernail to cut it. Now we want to label our paper with all the different techniques we're using, and I'm writing on the tape, not on my actual paper. So in all the areas of my picture where I did the tape resist and the wax resist, I want to label those so that I know that I used those and where on my worksheet I used them. Now that our resists are done, I'm ready to start prepping my paint. The first thing I want to do is reactivate my paint since it got all hard and dry from yesterday and make a nice smooth gradient on my plate. So I started with clean water and I made a long strip coming from my paint spot down into my mixing station. And I'm just gently feeding the paint into it on one side so I get a nice smooth gradient. I want it to be darkest right next to the paint and fade to lightest as I get further away because there's more water mixed in down here. This allows me to have the full shade or value of that paint whenever I'm ready to start painting. I can choose what color value of that I want to use and pull from that area of my paint palette. Now I've accidentally painted off screen here, so I'm going to demonstrate again our first technique, which is a solid wash. A solid wash is where you have one solid even color all over a whole space. You don't want there to be any watermarks, no gradients, no lighter areas. Everything is all the same. The trick to this is to work quickly and to finish it before any parts of it dry. If some of it dries and you try to go back into it, you're going to end up with those water ring kind of marks. And make sure to label that part of your paper as a solid wash. This next technique is called feathering out. Feathering out is when you can take a Kleenex and you can dab into an area and lighten it up. This works really well for clouds or if you got your paint too dark in one area. You can also kind of scrub out an area with clean water on your brush. So if you got an area darker than you want it to be, you can go over it with your brush with just clean water on it and then dab it with a Kleenex again, and you can pull even more of that value out of there. See how nice and light I got that? And again, I want to label on my tape that this is my feather out section. So I've got my solid wash and I've got my feather out written on here. For my next section, I'm going to be doing a gradient. So I've already labeled my tape underneath this chicken that I'm going to paint it with a gradient. And I'm going to load my brush up pretty thick with paint so there's not a lot of water on it, but there is a lot of paint in it. So I get a nice, vibrant, full, intense color down here at the bottom. And what I want to do is I want to let that paint run out of my brush as I work my way up. So to help it get thinner, what I'll do is I'll dip my brush and wipe it on the edge. I didn't rinse my brush out. I didn't swoosh it around. All I did was just introduce some more water into my brush and let a little bit of the pigment fall out into the cup. And then I can grab the paint where I left off and work it up a little bit. Then I'm going to dip and wipe. You can see more of that pigment came out of my brush, and I introduced more water into it so that I can start where I left off and work my way up on here. I want a nice smooth gradient where it's getting lighter and lighter just because there's less and less pigment and more water in my brush. But I also don't want to waterlog my picture. So this looks like a pretty good smooth gradient, but maybe I didn't get it dark enough where I want it to be down on bottom. So I'm going to load up my brush with a little bit more of my pink and go over it again. I want to try to blend it into what I have and work it while it's still wet. If I go back in and try to do this while it's dry, I'm going to end up leaving water rings on my picture. So I'm just working my way up, less pigment in my brush as I go. If I need to rinse it to get some off of there, I can. But it's really just kind of pushing less and less as I go to get that nice smooth gradient from light to dark. For my next bird, I'm going to do a wet on wet technique. So here I'm labeling my tape wet on wet with my brush. And I'm going to start with my paintbrush loaded with a light color. So I've washed the pink out of my brush. I've loaded it with some yellow. I'm going to put it on here. I've got quite a bit of water mixed in with this so that it's a nice wet area. I don't want it to be a dry brush. I'm going to keep adding paint and water in there until I get a nice strong pigment and it's nice and wet. For this technique, if the yellow is dry when I go to do the next step, it's not going to work. So here I even added a little bit more yellow on top just so it's nice and fresh and wet. Then I can take another color and with it wet in my brush, I can drop it into the yellow. Because the yellow is wet where I drop the pink on top, they're going to blend together into small little blooms of color. For the next technique, we're going to be doing some scratching. Now, scratching can be done with a paper clip or with a mechanical pencil with like all the lead in, so you're just using like the plastic tip. And what you're doing is you're just dragging it across the paper while the paint is still wet. It's going to do two things. It's going to create a valley that your pigment is going to fall down into, and it's going to create the illusion of this dark line. Or either that, or if you're using a paper clip, it might actually be kind of scoring your paper a little bit and ripping it up some, and that's going to draw even more pigment into there and make a darker line still. So that's why I like the mechanical pencil a little bit better, but a paper clip also works for this. Here I'm doing some hatching and some cross hatching. I can create that illusion of depth by adding some of those textures in there. Next, I'm going to mix a new color for our next technique, and I want to make a nice light orange. So I'm going to start with yellow and then rinse my brush out to get a little pink to mix to that. And for this technique, I need a really wet pigment. So I'm going to introduce some more water to it so I've got a nice little puddle. And I'm going to paint in this area on my chicken. I want to lay the paint on quickly enough so that I can work with it while it's still wet. And I want to put it on wet enough so that it will work for the next technique. So my brush is pretty wet. I'm working pretty quickly. I'm going to lay it on here and go back over it so it's a nice little puddle of paint on my paper. And here you can see I even just take straight water out of the cup and lay it on top. That way I know that there's plenty of water and pigment in this little puddle that I've created for this section. Next, I'm going to use some salt. I've got this little dog here, and I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt on him. And the trick is to let it sit and dry completely. Don't try to mess with it or move it or anything. Got a little extra salt on here that I can clean off. But this needs to completely dry before I can mess with it at all anymore. So I'm going to label this as my salt and move on to my next technique. Now my next technique I accidentally painted off screen, where I used a sponge and I dabbed to get a texture. You can see it below the chickens and on that one chicken's wing. But just go ahead and add some sponging in some places and label that with your pencil where you did the sponging. For this next technique, we're going to work with hard and soft edges. So I'm going to start with a clean brush and I'm going to load it up pretty heavy with pigment so that it is full. And anywhere where I just paint on dry paper, I'm going to get a nice hard edge with my paintbrush. So for example, on the outside edges of my chickens, I want there to be a hard edge. But then maybe I want my chicken to have some form and feel like a smooth blend. So I need a soft edge here. To do that, I'm going to just add a little bit of water and work it and blend it so that it's not a hard edge here, that it's fading away into a soft edge. Maybe you even need to use like a Kleenex and come in here and dab off some areas so that you can see kind of the gradient blending out. A hard edge is going to have a crisp line like on the outside, and here on the inside I have an example of a soft edge. Hard edge, soft edge. And label hard and soft edges on your tape. I'm going to go ahead and finish painting this chicken, still honoring my hard and soft edges, just adding some more value in here. And then here again, I'm going to add some scratching technique. I'm not drawing with the lead of my pencil. I'm just using the tip of this mechanical pencil to press into the paper to create a valley. And then the color of the watercolor pigment is falling down in that valley to create the illusion of that dark line there. There's only one technique left that I haven't shown yet, and that is blooms, which I did in this last chicken accidentally when I wasn't recording. That's just similar to the wet on wet, where you put down a wet color and you drop it into it. But you can do blooms of color, or you can do blooms of water, where you just drop clean water into wet paint and it will push that paint around and create some fun blooms. So I played around with that on my last chicken and labeled it. And now I'm just going through and adding some extra details, trying out some of the techniques in different places, and finishing painting in the rest of my chicken so that my whole design will be done. This is a nice way for you to be creative with this design. Now that you've learned the techniques, apply them in different ways. I'm going to remove all the salt when it's completely dry. Make sure to throw the salt in the trash. And you can also remove the tape when it's completely dry. Make sure to throw the tape into the trash. And for this last section, I'm going to fill my sky in with one more great big wash. Remember, you would think a wash would be easy because you're just doing a solid color. But with watercolor, it's hard to get a nice, even, solid color along edges where your brush stopped and you're going back in with more paint or more water. You have to reload your brush and come back into it and have nice smooth transitions between. And if you have any areas that you have to go back and rework, it's almost nearly impossible to get a smooth transition without leaving those kind of watermarks where the water pushes a bloom around it. So as much as you can try to blend one brush stroke into the next and kind of cover all those little imperfections to get as smooth of a wash as you can get for your background. Here I've mixed a couple colors together to make a new color. And I'm creating what is called a paper dam. That's where I leave a tiny little bit of white space around an area whenever I paint it, so that the wet paint that I'm painting with won't accidentally blend with any wet paint on the chickens that hasn't dried yet. So a paper dam is where you just leave dry white paper between two areas. Here it's too dark, so I just dip my brush right into water and mix that on there to lighten that out. And whenever I push it around and thin it out, it should blend out. And I'll mix it in with the paint that I had on there before. At this point, we've used all of our techniques. If there's any areas of your painting that you need to finish filling in, you can do that so that the whole thing is painted. Now my chickens are all completely done and painted in. I've used all the techniques. I've labeled them on the tape below so that we can see them all. We have the tape and wax resist, the blooms, the hard and soft edges, the salt texture, the wet on wet, the scratching, the gradient and sponging, the solid wash and feathering out. Put your name on it and turn it in.